David's heart stopped when he saw his wife's silver Lexus parked in front of his son's house, a place she had no reason to be. It was the kind of sight that makes your blood run cold, the kind that screams betrayal before a single word is spoken. He killed the engine, stepped closer, and what he was about to hear would shatter 25 years of trust in an instant. This was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was a conspiracy unfolding right under his nose. And once the truth spilled through that window, there would be no turning back. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, because what comes next will leave you breathless. David stood frozen, his breath shallow as he pressed himself against the brick wall, the half-open window above him spilling out words that sliced deeper than any knife. Inside, his wife Linda's voice floated with a chill he had never heard before. It was light, musical even, the same laughter that had once steadied him during sleepless nights and soothed him after long days on construction sites. But now, that sound wasn't warmth, it was poison. She wasn't laughing with him, she was laughing at him. Every syllable dripped with contempt as she leaned toward Greg, his son's smug lawyer friend, and spoke about David's empire as if it were already hers. "The construction business alone is worth $12 million, she said, her tone cold and calculating. Add the rental properties, the vacation home, the investments, we're looking at nearly $20 million total. Greg's voice came next, polished, slick, like a salesman who had never missed a closing. The beauty of it, Linda, is his trusting nature. He's practically handed us everything. His accounts, his deeds, his records. We've been copying them for months. He doesn't even know. He actually believes you love him." The words hit David like hammer blows. His hand shook, fumbling for his phone, and with a trembling thumb, he hit record. He could barely see through the curtains, but he didn't need to. Every detail was etched into his mind. His wife of 25 years sat on his son's couch, not discussing love or family, but strategizing his destruction. Greg leaned against the bookshelf, arms crossed, the tone of a man who had studied every weakness of his enemy and was savoring the kill. Linda nodded, playing the role of devoted wife while dismantling his life piece by piece. David's chest tightened, his pulse thundering so loud he feared they might hear it. He had built everything with his bare hands, every board nailed into houses that carried other families, every dollar earned from 16-hour days, every sacrifice made so Linda could have the life she always said she dreamed of. And now he realized that dream was a performance. The woman he thought had stood beside him all those years had been rehearsing, waiting for her cue to strike. Greg's words kept coming, smooth and deliberate. File in June, claim irreconcilable differences. With the new statutes, she's entitled to half, plus spousal support for life. By September, you'll be free to do whatever you want with whoever you want. Linda's laugh chimed again, cruel and gleaming like broken glass. God, the man actually believes I love him. David's heart clenched, a soundless gasp catching in his throat. For decades he had believed every anniversary note, every kiss in the dark, every whispered, "I love you." Now, in one shattering moment, all of it collapsed under the weight of her mockery. He pressed harder against the wall, sweat beading on his forehead despite the April chill. A twig snapped under his shoe, loud in the night silence. Inside, the voices cut off. "Did you hear that?" Linda's voice sharpened. "Probably the neighbor's cat," Greg said quickly, though the unease in his tone betrayed him. David dared not move, his heart pounding like a drum. They paused, then resumed, each word recorded, each word another nail in the coffin of his old life. 15 minutes stretched like hours, his body locked between terror and rage. When he finally pulled himself back toward the car, he felt like a man returning from a battlefield. The recording in his pocket throbbed like a pulse, proof of a betrayal so profound It made his hands numb on the steering wheel. He slid into the seat, staring at the skin of his palms, the same hands that had built everything they were plotting to steal. Those hands had carried Linda through their wedding night, had held their newborn son, had signed every contract that funded the luxury she flaunted. And all along, she had been studying them like blueprints, mapping every line, every weakness, every nail she could pry loose. Her laughter echoed in his ears, mocking, searing. The man actually believes I love him. And the worst part was that until 30 minutes ago, he had. The front door opened suddenly. Linda stepped out first, her designer bag swinging, confidence radiating. Greg followed close, his tie straightened, his expression smug. Their eyes widened when they saw him sitting in the car, headlights cutting across the driveway. David forced himself to breathe, to arrange his features into something resembling calm. "Alan," Linda stammered, her voice climbing high, "what are you doing here?" He gripped the wheel, his pulse roaring, but his voice came out smooth. "Just finished a job inspection nearby. Thought I'd stop and see Ryan." He stepped out of the car, every muscle trembling beneath the mask of casual words. Greg's gray eyes narrowed, searching his face with the precision of a cross-examiner. Linda filled the silence quickly, too quickly. "We were just helping Greg with some legal documents." David smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides 1,000 storms. "Oh?" He tilted his head. "I thought you'd be at work until 6. Something about the Henderson proposal, wasn't it?" For the briefest second, Linda froze, a flicker of panic breaking through the practiced charm. "Headache," she said quickly. "I left early." David nodded, eyes sliding to Greg. "Working on an interesting case?" "Asset division," Greg muttered, then caught himself. "Divorce client. Complex situation." The irony twisted like a knife in David's gut. He kept his tone light, but inside, his mind was a storm. They were cornered animals now, glancing at each other, testing his reactions. "How long have you been here, David?" Linda asked, her smile painted thin. "Just pulled up," he lied smoothly. "Why?" "No reason. You seem tense." He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The woman plotting to take every dollar from his life, asking if he was okay. He slipped his phone into view, pretending to check the time. Greg's eyes lingered a second too long. They knew, or at least they feared. Back in the car, David drove in silence, the world outside a blur of lights and shadows. His hands steadied now, not from peace, but from something colder, sharper. The shock was fading, replaced by an analytical calm. They thought he was a blind old fool, a man who couldn't spot a conspiracy if it wore a neon sign. They had underestimated him. They had mistaken kindness for weakness, trust for stupidity. He pulled into his driveway, the house looming in the darkness. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage, where every laugh, every hug, every conversation had been scripted for someone else's gain. He sat in the car, staring at the home he had built board by board, nail by nail, as memories collided with the truth. He had once believed Linda's laughter was the sound of love. Tonight, it was the soundtrack of betrayal. And yet, beneath the devastation, something stirred. Not anger, not grief. Something colder. Calculation. The same mind that had turned a single truck into a construction empire now turned toward a new blueprint. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a war they didn't know they had started. He reached for his phone, replayed the recording, and listened again as Linda mocked his love. The man actually believes I love him. His jaw tightened. They thought they had been playing chess with a man who only knew checkers. They were about to learn how wrong they were. And as he stepped into the silence of his house, one thought carried him forward. They had no idea what was coming next. David sat alone in his car, the glow of the dashboard lights painting his face in pale blue, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly the leather creaked under the strain. The recording on his phone was still running, the voices of Linda and Greg seeping into the silence like venom. Every word he had heard outside that window echoed inside his skull, each sentence another crack in the foundation of the life he thought he had built. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't paranoia. It was truth. For 2 years they had been conspiring, documenting his accounts, preparing a strategy to strip him bare. 2 years of smiles across the dinner table, of kisses on the cheek, of empty I love yous whispered in the dark. All of it was theater. Linda's words rang the loudest, a cruel refrain he couldn't escape. The man actually believes I love him. He wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to deny it. But the laughter he had heard from her lips wasn't the laughter of a woman who loved. It was the laughter of someone mocking the fool who had trusted her. He thought back to their 25th anniversary just months ago, the card she had written in her elegant blue script, thanking him for making her dreams come true. He had tucked it into his drawer like a treasure, believing it was real, believing every word came from a place of devotion. Now, staring at the house he had built with his own hands, he realized those words were as hollow as the woman who wrote them. He remembered the long nights in the early years, when he would come home covered in dust, hands blistered, shoulders aching from swinging hammers until the stars came out. Linda had greeted him with warm meals, gentle touches, whispers of pride. He had thought she was his partner, his anchor. But while he had been building their future, she had been building her performance, studying the role until she played it so well he never saw the truth. The weight of 25 years pressed on his chest, each memory turning sour under the glare of her betrayal. Their wedding day, when she had walked down the aisle radiant in ivory silk. The way her eyes had sparkled when she told him she believed in him, in his dreams. Their son's birth, when she had clutched the baby to her chest, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. The family vacations, the Christmas mornings filled with laughter, the endless photos of milestones that now looked like evidence in a trial of deception. Had she been lying then too? Had every smile, every touch, every tear been part of her strategy? He couldn't answer, and the not knowing hollowed him out even more than the certainty of her betrayal. The recording ended, leaving only silence. David stared at the phone in his hand, his reflection faint in the black screen, and for the first time in his life, he didn't recognize the man looking back. He had been a provider, a builder, a husband, a father. Now he felt like a fool who had poured his life into a script written by someone else. He pressed play again, needing to hear it, needing to let the poison course through him until it hardened into something unbreakable. Linda's laughter filled the car once more, sharp and cold, followed by Greg's smug voice describing how easily David had handed them everything. It was almost too much, but he forced himself to listen, forced himself to absorb every syllable until it carved into his bones. If he stopped now, if he allowed himself to collapse under the weight of it, they would win before the war even began. He closed his eyes, the image of Linda on their porch flashing before him. The way she would water the flowers in spring, humming as if nothing in the world could touch them. The way she would lean against him in bed, her hand resting on his chest as though it belonged there. He had loved her with every fiber of his being, had believed her presence was proof that all his sacrifices were worth it. And now he realized that love had been one-sided, a devotion exploited and discarded when the time was right. The devastation was total, like standing on a bridge as it collapsed beneath his feet. He wasn't just losing a wife. He was losing the illusion that his life had been built on love. His chest ached with a grief so raw it felt physical. He thought of the years he had wasted, the years he could never get back. The laughter at their dinner table, the soft arguments over trivial things, the plans for the future, all of it dissolved into ash. And still, beneath the devastation, a question burned. Why now? Why, after all these years, had she decided the mask could come off? He thought of Greg, younger, ambitious, a man who knew how to manipulate the law to his advantage. Linda hadn't just found a co-conspirator. She had found someone willing to weaponize her bitterness, someone who saw David not as a husband, but as a target. The truth settled over him, heavy and final. For 2 years, Linda had rehearsed her exit, timing it perfectly to maximize her gain. 2 years of studying his accounts, asking the right questions, feigning interest in his business. 2 years of planning his downfall while pretending to share his bed. David's fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles whitened. Every instinct told him to storm back into that house, to drag the truth into the light, to confront them with the venom they had spilled so carelessly. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. Because as broken as he felt, he knew anger would only serve their game. They expected outrage. They expected him to crumble. What they didn't expect was the silence of a man who was already calculating his next move. The house loomed in the darkness as he finally stepped inside. The silence was suffocating, not the comforting quiet he once loved, but the absence of truth, the echo of betrayal bouncing off every wall. He walked past the mantel, eyes catching on the wedding photo, the framed smile that now looked like a mask. His knees nearly buckled, but he forced himself forward, collapsing into the leather chair he had always claimed as his own. His hands shook as he buried his face in them, the grief crashing over him like waves. For a moment, he let himself drown, let the tears fall for the man he had been and the marriage he thought he had. Then slowly, he pulled himself upright, wiping his face, his jaw tightening. Linda thought she had buried him already, thought her performance had blinded him completely. But she had underestimated him. The man who had built a fortune from nothing, who had outlasted recessions, lawsuits, and competitors, wasn't going to collapse under betrayal. He was going to turn it into fuel. As he stared into the darkness of the room, one thought carried him forward, sharper than grief, colder than rage. If Linda believed she had been playing the long game, she was about to discover that David had been building his entire life for moments like this. The devastation was real, the betrayal absolute, but from the ruins of 25 years, something new was rising. And what he was about to do next would change everything. The front door creaked open, spilling a strip of golden light across the driveway. And David's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. First came Linda, her designer bag swinging at her side as if she had just stepped out of a boutique instead of a den of betrayal. Behind her followed Greg, his tie loosened, his face carrying the smug calm of a man who thought he had everything under control. For a split second, both froze when they saw David's car idling at the curb, his silhouette framed by the dim interior light. Linda's expression faltered, the confidence draining into something brittle. Alan, her voice pitched higher than usual, a nervous crack she couldn't quite hide. "What are you doing here?" David opened the door slowly, forcing his movements to look casual. Though every nerve in his body screamed for him to lunge, to shout, to drag the truth out of her right there in front of the man she'd chosen as her ally. Instead, he stepped onto the gravel with a carefully practiced calm. "Just finished a site inspection nearby," he said smoothly, his tone steady but hollow. "Thought I'd stop by to see Ryan." Linda's eyes flickered, 1,000 calculations racing behind them, the way a liar scrambles to remember which story they told last. Greg shifted subtly closer to her, protective, his lawyer's gaze sharp and probing. David met it with a thin smile, the kind that hides storms behind glass. "She's not here," Linda blurted. "We were just helping Greg sort some legal documents." The lie tumbled from her lips too quickly, too rehearsed. David tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Legal documents? Interesting." His eyes shifted to Greg, and the younger man cleared his throat, trying to reclaim his composure. "Asset division," he said without thinking, then caught himself too late. "Divorce client. Complicated case." David's smile didn't move, but his eyes narrowed a fraction, catching every crack in the facade. The irony cut through him like steel. They were so arrogant they could barely keep their story straight. "I thought you'd be at work until 6, David said casually, turning back to Linda. "Something about the Henderson proposal, wasn't it?" For the briefest second, her face faltered, a shadow of panic crossing her eyes before she forced it down, pasting on the same charm she had worn for decades. "Headache," she said quickly. "I left early." He nodded as if satisfied with the explanation, but inside his chest, his heart hammered with the rhythm of betrayal. He wanted to shout the truth, to rip the mask from her face and expose her for what she was. Instead, he slipped his phone from his pocket, letting it flash in his hand under the porch light as if checking the time. Greg's gaze locked on it instantly, his jaw tightening, his lawyer's instincts sniffing danger. They suspected something, maybe even feared the worst, but David's calm performance kept them guessing. "You seem tense," Linda ventured, her smile sharp at the edges, brittle as glass. "Everything okay?" David almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the woman plotting his ruin, asking about his well-being. "Long day," he said lightly, sliding back toward his car door. "Don't let me interrupt." Greg placed his hand on Linda's lower back, the motion small but intimate, reflexive. The sight hit David like a knife between the ribs, but his face gave nothing away. They were testing him, prodding for a slip, a reaction, anything to confirm how much he knew. He gave them nothing, just that thin smile and a nod, the kind a man gives when he's already 3 moves ahead. Linda's voice followed him as he opened the car door. "I'll be home soon. Just need to finish up here." "Take your time," he replied smoothly, lowering himself into the driver's seat. Before closing the door, he turned back, as if remembering something offhand. "Oh, Linda, Dr. Patterson's office called about rescheduling your physical. Something about a conflict with your work schedule." For a fraction of a second, her face went blank, the mask slipping. Then she recovered with practice speed. "Must be a mix-up," she said with a shrug. "I'll call them later. No worries." David slid into the car, the engine rumbling to life as his eyes lingered on them one last time. In the rearview mirror, he saw them draw closer together, heads bent in urgent conversation the moment his car disappeared around the corner. The drive home passed in silence, his thoughts colliding in a storm that threatened to rip him apart. His heart still pounded, but the rage that had nearly broken free at the door now calcified into something colder. He had seen the look in their eyes, the suspicion, the panic, the scramble to hold their lies together. They knew he might have heard something, but they didn't know how much. That was his advantage, and he would wield it like a blade. As the city lights blurred past, his grip on the steering wheel steadied. The time for grief was over. The time for rage was coming. But first, there would be silence, the kind of silence that makes conspirators nervous, that forces them to wonder how much of their game had been exposed. When he pulled into the driveway of the house he had built, the place felt different. The manicured lawn, the fountain Linda had insisted on, the lights glowing warmly in the windows. All of it looked staged now, like a set piece in a play where he had been cast as the fool. He sat in the car for several long minutes staring at the front door, his reflection faint in the glass. 25 years of marriage had just been reduced to a performance, and he was the audience who had finally realized the play was rigged. Inside, the silence was hollow, the air heavy. He walked past the photos lining the mantel, their wedding picture smiling down at him like a cruel joke. He sank into the leather recliner, the one Linda had always hated, calling it ugly, out of place in her perfectly curated living room. Tonight, it felt like a throne, a seat for a man who had just survived the moment his world collapsed and refused to bow. His heart was still raging, but his mind sharpened with clarity. He had looked into their eyes, and he knew this was no longer about love or betrayal. It was war. And the beauty of war was that it wasn't fought with emotion, but with strategy. They thought they were the only ones capable of deceit, of planning, of playing the long game. They were wrong. He reached for his phone, the recording safe inside. 43 minutes of damning evidence. He replayed a snippet, Linda's voice mocking the life they had shared. God, the man actually believes I love him. His jaw tightened, but his lips curled into something new. Not a smile, not quite. It was resolve, sharp and unyielding. They thought they were the predators. Tonight, David understood he had been cast as prey. Tomorrow, they would realize just how wrong they were. And as the night settled over the quiet house, one thought burned brighter than the rest. They had no idea what was coming next. David closed the front door behind him, the echo of the latch reverberating through the house like a hollow reminder of what it had once meant. The silence inside was heavy, suffocating, no longer the quiet refuge of home, but the absence of truth. He paused in the entryway, the scent of polished wood and faint perfume lingering in the air, and for the first time, it felt foreign. His eyes drifted to the mantel, and there it was, the wedding photo that had watched over him for decades. Linda in ivory silk, radiant, glowing with what he had believed was love, and himself standing beside her, younger, proud, filled with the certainty that he had found his partner for life. Tonight, that photo mocked him. Every brush of her veil, every smile, every promise whispered in those vows was poisoned now, a prop in a performance that had lasted 25 years. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he traced the frame, as though touching it would explain how he had missed the cracks hiding beneath her painted smile. His eyes moved along the row of photos lining the shelves. Their son Ryan as a boy, grinning with missing teeth on Christmas morning, wrapping paper scattered around the living room like confetti. Ryan in his cap and gown, standing tall with pride, while David and Linda stood on either side, a family that seemed unbreakable. Vacation snapshots at the lake, Linda with sunglasses perched on her head, laughter frozen in time, David holding a fishing pole with his arm around her waist. He had thought those were the best days of his life. But now each photo was a lie, a still frame in a story written to keep him blind. The memories that once warmed him now cut like glass, sharp and merciless. He lowered himself into his leather recliner, the one piece of furniture Linda had always despised, calling it ugly, insisting it didn't fit with her carefully curated decor. Tonight, it felt like the only thing in the room that belonged to him. He sank into it, staring at the photographs until they blurred, his vision swimming with tears he refused to let fall. His chest ached with grief, not just for the woman he had lost, but for the man he had been, the man who had believed her love was real. He remembered the nights he'd worked until dawn, coming home with sore hands and an aching back, and how she'd been there with a warm meal, gentle words, and a kiss that he thought spoke of gratitude. He remembered how she used to rest her head on his shoulder in the evenings, telling him she was proud of him. All of it hollow now, every tender gesture revealed as another line in the script she had been perfecting for years. The weight of emptiness pressed against him, crushing in its enormity. 25 years of devotion had been nothing more than an investment to her, a waiting game until the payoff was worth the betrayal. He looked at the framed card from their anniversary on the kitchen table, her handwriting delicate in blue ink, thanking him for making her dreams come true. He had read those words with pride once, believing he had given her the life she wanted. Now they read like a cruel joke, a reminder that her dreams had never been about them, but about her alone. He closed his eyes, and the sound of her laughter from earlier seeped into the quiet, mocking him, echoing through his mind until it twisted his stomach. The emptiness turned suffocating as he tried to recall moments when her love might have been genuine. Was it ever real? Did she ever mean it? Or had every kiss, every whispered word of devotion been rehearsed? He thought of the night Ryan graduated from high school, Linda crying into his chest, telling him he was the best father in the world. He thought of Christmas mornings when she insisted on elaborate decorations, when she laughed as the family gathered by the fire. Were those tears, that laughter, that joy, were any of them true? He couldn't be sure, and the not knowing hollowed him more than the betrayal itself. His gaze fell on the dining room table, polished and gleaming, the place where countless family dinners had unfolded. He remembered the clinking of silverware, the hum of conversation, the comfort of belonging. But now he could see the subtle shifts he had ignored. Linda's distracted eyes when he spoke about his projects, her quick deflections when he asked about her day, the way her hand lingered on her phone a little too long when messages came in late at night. The signs had been there, etched into the ordinary, but he had been too blinded by love, too trusting to question them. He stood, restless, pacing the length of the room, his eyes snagging on every relic of the life they had shared. The vase she had insisted on buying in Paris, now just a vessel of dust. The throw blanket she had draped over the couch, chosen for its color rather than comfort. The small touches that had once made the house feel alive now stood as reminders of her manipulation. Even the silence between the walls felt staged, as though every echo belonged to her design. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, as the grief curdled into something harder. He walked to the bookshelf, pulling down an album. It opened to a page filled with photos of their early years, young and reckless, smiles so wide they almost looked real. He traced Linda's face with his finger, searching for signs of the woman he thought he had married. But all he saw was calculation. He slammed the book shut, the sound reverberating through the hollow house. His breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling with the weight of loss. Yet, beneath the emptiness, something was shifting. David returned to the recliner, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as though it could provide answers. He had lost her long before tonight, he realized. The betrayal wasn't born in a single conversation. It had been growing, festering, years in the making. He had been grieving unknowingly for years, mourning a love that had died quietly while he was too busy building their empire to notice. That grief now burned away the last fragments of denial, leaving only clarity in its wake. The house was dark, but his mind was alight with images. Linda's laughter with Greg, the manila folder of documents on the table, the smug confidence in their voices as they plotted his ruin. Those memories chased away the warmth of old photographs, replacing nostalgia with cold purpose. He knew he couldn't live in the past anymore. The photos, the cards, the memories, they were ghosts, and ghosts couldn't fight. He needed to. He rose again, walking through the house, switching off the lights one by one, leaving each room in darkness. As he reached the staircase, he glanced back at the mantel, at the wedding photo that had mocked him when he first walked in. He stared at it for a long moment, the smile he once cherished, now hollow. Then he turned away, climbing the stairs with heavy steps. The grief was still there, raw and jagged, but it no longer controlled him. The emptiness had carved out space for something new, something sharper. In the quiet of his study, he sat at the desk that had seen decades of contracts and blueprints, the place where his empire had been born. He pulled out a fresh notebook, setting it before him like a weapon. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he hovered over the page. For a long moment, he stared into the silence, the ghosts of memories pressing in around him. Then, with steady strokes, he began to write. Names, dates, accounts, every detail he had overheard. The grief was still heavy, but it had hardened into resolve. David leaned back in the chair, his eyes burning with exhaustion, but clear with intent. The photographs downstairs might haunt him. The memories might cut him, but they no longer defined him. Linda thought she had buried him under the weight of their past, but she hadn't realized what she had created in the process. Out of grief had come clarity, and out of emptiness was rising something far more dangerous. As he closed the notebook and set it aside, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The past was gone. The love was dead. But what came next would not be mourning. It would be war. David sat in the dark study, the shadows stretching long across the floor as the last traces of tears dried on his face. His grief had burned itself down to embers, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt unnatural, too calm for the storm raging inside. He stared at the open notebook before him, the ink from his first notes gleaming under the lamp's light, names and numbers scrawled with a precision that matched the clarity now crystallizing in his mind. Every photo downstairs, every memory of Linda's laughter, every moment he had replayed until it tore at him, none of it mattered now. What mattered was the truth. And the truth was that his marriage had been a stage play designed to rob him blind. That realization no longer hollowed him. It sharpened him. The man who had built his empire from sawdust and sweat was still here, and he would not be dismantled by the likes of Linda and Greg. His jaw set as he leaned back in the leather chair, the same one where he had once pored over blueprints and contracts late into the night. His mind, once fogged with grief, now ran clear and cold, calculating like the machinery of a clock. He thought of the tricks he had learned over decades of survival in construction. How to outbid competitors without showing his hand. How to anticipate a market crash before the banks even noticed. How to secure deals while others drowned in debt. The same instincts that had kept him alive in business would now serve him in war. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't a construction site or a boardroom. It was his own family. He reached for his phone again, replaying Greg's voice, smug and careless, spelling out their plan. Bank statements, property deeds, valuations, already copied, already prepared. They had underestimated him, assuming he lived in ignorance, that his trust blinded him. But ignorance had never built an empire. David knew his assets better than anyone, knew which accounts could be frozen, which contracts shielded from outside eyes, which properties sat safely tucked under corporate structures they couldn't touch. He had always played long games, laying foundations years before he ever needed them. Now those same habits were his salvation. The grief that had weighed on him only hours earlier began to feel like wasted time. His heart, once broken by Linda's cruel laughter, hardened into steel. He rose from the chair, moving with the controlled purpose of a man on a mission, flicking through drawers until he found the locked box at the back of the cabinet. Inside were documents that Linda had never known existed, trusts and accounts that stretched beyond the surface of what she and Greg had been cataloging. While they believed they held the keys to his fortune, they hadn't even touched the real vault. He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with cold satisfaction. Let them think they were clever. Let them think they had already won. The longer they believed, the harder their fall would be. He set the documents out across the desk, lining them up like chess pieces. He scribbled notes on a fresh page: assets, leverage points, vulnerabilities. Linda's credit card bills flashed in his memory. Her sudden spending habits, the lunches at the country club, the clothes, the spa treatments. Greg's debts were no secret either. Word had drifted through the industry about his champagne tastes and unpaid bills. David scribbled down each weakness, each crack in their armor. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. It was about dismantling them piece by piece until there was nothing left. The sound of the clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, each second a reminder that time mattered. But for once, David wasn't rushing. Strategy required patience, and patience was something he had in abundance. He leaned back, letting the silence wrap around him, feeling his pulse slow, his mind settle into a rhythm. They thought they were predators, circling an old fool, but they had mistaken stillness for weakness. What they didn't see was the calculation, the way his silence gave him the chance to gather strength. His eyes drifted again to the mantel in the other room, to the photographs that had cut him so deeply earlier that night. The grief still pressed at the edges of his mind, but now it was different, no longer debilitating. It was fuel. Each photo was a reminder of what had been stolen, of how thoroughly Linda had played her part, of how blind he had been. And that pain was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. He would use it to sharpen every decision, to remind himself never to fall back into the trap of love-clouding judgment. He picked up the pen once more, writing with deliberate strokes. First, secure the accounts. Second, freeze the lines of credit. Third, expose Greg's debts and professional misconduct. Fourth, build a firewall of allies who would stand beside him when the storm broke. He had names in mind already: bankers who owed him favors, contractors who trusted his word, board members who valued his integrity. These people had seen him fight for his business, had watched him build from nothing, had benefited from his success. When the time came, they would rally to his side, not Linda's. David rose again, walking to the window. Outside, the night stretched silent and dark, the city lights glittering in the distance like scattered embers. He stared out, his reflection faint in the glass. And for the first time since overhearing the betrayal, he saw not a broken man, but the fighter he had always been. The grief had cut him down, but it had also cleared away the illusions. Now he stood unburdened, sharper, colder, more dangerous. He whispered into the silence, not for anyone else but for himself. You thought you could bury me. You thought you could turn 25 years into ash. But you have no idea who you're dealing with. The words hung in the air, a vow to himself, a promise that he would not only survive this, but win. As he turned back to the desk, the lamp cast his shadow long across the wall, stretching tall and unyielding. The tears were gone. The grief was behind him. In its place was resolve, forged from betrayal, hardened by loss, and sharpened by rage. And as he sat again in the leather chair, pen scratching across paper, one thought drove him forward with chilling clarity. Linda and Greg believed they had played him. Soon they would learn that every move they made had been nothing but the opening act. The real game was about to begin, and David was no longer a husband mourning a lost love. He was a strategist preparing for war, and when the moment came, he would not miss. The morning sun cut through the blinds of David's study, striping the desk in harsh lines of light and shadow. He hadn't slept. His eyes burned. His body ached from the weight of the previous night. But his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The notebook lay open, the pages already filled with scribbled notes, arrows, and lists. The grief had hardened into steel, and now that steel was cutting through the fog of lies. He pushed aside the framed card from their anniversary, once a treasure, now a taunt, and spread out the bank statements he had pulled from the locked file. Numbers never lied. People did. The first irregularity was small, almost laughable. A transfer of a few $100s marked under household expenses. But David's eye for detail caught the pattern. Transfers that recurred monthly, sometimes weekly, each disguised under vague categories. Groceries, book club fees, volunteer committee. He traced the dates, his pen tapping the page in rhythm with his rising pulse. The amounts grew bolder over time. Hundreds became thousands, then tens of thousands, funneling steadily into an account he didn't recognize. He typed the account number into his secure banking portal, bypassing layers of passwords and firewalls he had set up years ago. The screen blinked back with confirmation, and the name tied to the account made his stomach clench. Daniel Whitaker, Greg's full name. For a long moment he sat motionless, staring at the name as if the letters themselves had mocked him. His wife had been siphoning money into the account of his son's smug lawyer friend, disguising it as book club expenses and charity donations. The very man who had leaned against the bookshelf with contempt in his voice now stood revealed as not just her co-conspirator, but her financial partner. David's fist clenched so hard the pen snapped between his fingers, ink bleeding across the page like a wound. He wiped his hand on a rag, forcing his breath steady again. Fury wouldn't help him now. Cold, controlled calculation would. He began cross-referencing Linda's credit card bills. Luxury lunches at the country club, $400 a meal. Spa treatments that aligned with the nights she had claimed to be working late on volunteer events. Designer handbags purchased the same week she had argued with him about cutting grocery costs. Each expense screamed hypocrisy, each receipt a confession. He wrote them down one by one, his pen carving into the paper with brutal precision. When he traced the timeline, another truth surfaced, and it was worse than he had imagined. The siphoning hadn't started recently. It had begun nearly 2 years ago, aligning perfectly with Greg's entry into their lives as more than just a family friend. David remembered that day clearly, Ryan's wedding. Greg had given a toast that dripped with false charm, praising the family, praising Ryan, praising even David himself as a man to look up to. And Linda had laughed at his jokes, leaning in closer than necessary. David had ignored it, dismissing it as flattery. Now he knew better. The conspiracy had been seeded that night, and from then on, the web had tightened around him. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, every detail cutting deeper into his resolve. Linda's sudden interest in his business reports, her probing questions about property deeds and valuations, her insistence on joint accounts while she quietly maintained separate credit cards, all of it had been reconnaissance. While he built their empire, she had been dismantling it behind his back. And Greg, drowning in debts and legal shortcuts, had seen his chance in her greed. Together, they had crafted the perfect illusion. A loyal wife, a trusted friend. Together, they had carved out a hidden empire funded by David's sweat. But now the illusion was shattered, and David wasn't the blind fool they believed him to be. He printed the statements, stacking them neatly, each page another weapon. The evidence was overwhelming. Unauthorized transfers, fraudulent expenses, financial entanglements between his wife and another man. He didn't rage, didn't scream. Instead, he felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. The betrayal ran deeper than he had ever imagined, but so did his reach. He thought of the men he'd worked with over the years, contractors who trusted him, bankers who respected him, accountants who owed him favors. Greg might have the law on his side, Linda might have her performance polished to perfection, but David had something neither of them could counterfeit: reputation. Decades of honest work, of paying his men on time, of shaking hands and keeping promises. When the storm broke, people would believe him. They always had. He turned back to the statements circling Greg's name in bold strokes. Vindication burned through him, sharper than any anger. For every dollar stolen, he would reclaim tenfold. For every lie told, he would uncover 3 truths. This wasn't just about protecting what he had built. It was about dismantling them, exposing them for what they were, parasites feeding off his life's work. He could already see the cracks forming. Linda's desperation for status, Greg's drowning debts, their arrogance in believing he wouldn't notice. He would widen those cracks until their entire scheme collapsed on top of them. The study felt colder now, but it wasn't emptiness anymore. It was clarity. He opened another drawer, pulling out files that Linda had never known existed. Accounts offshore, structured trusts, assets layered so deep even a forensic accountant would take months to unravel them. While she and Greg celebrated their cleverness in cataloging the obvious, they had missed the real treasure. He almost laughed, the sound low and humorless. They thought they had stripped him bare, when in truth they had only skimmed the surface. He sat back, staring at the stacks of evidence, and felt the fury coil tighter. No longer uncontrolled, but precise. Controlled fury. That was what this was now. Every emotion was a blade, and he intended to wield them with exacting force. He had been the provider, the husband, the father, the fool. But no more. Now he was the hunter, and Linda and Greg had just stepped into his sights. David closed the notebook, the pen lying broken beside it, and stood. The study bathed in dim light. The house was quiet, but it no longer suffocated him. Instead, it felt like a war room, each document a weapon, each memory a reminder of what was at stake. He looked once more at the photos on the shelf, at Linda's smile frozen in time. And this time he didn't feel grief. He felt resolve. The lies might have stretched back years, but they ended here. He turned off the lamp, leaving the study in darkness, and walked toward the stairs with steady steps. The betrayal had run deeper than he imagined, but so would his retribution. And as he climbed, one thought burned clear in his mind. They had no idea just how much truth he was about to uncover. David woke before dawn, the house still cloaked in silence, the air heavy with the stale weight of the previous night's discoveries. His body felt stiff, his bones aching from the hours hunched over documents. But his mind was sharpened to a lethal edge. The grief that had once left him hollow now fueled his every move. He poured a black coffee, didn't bother with sugar, and sat down in his study with the calm efficiency of a man preparing for battle. His notebook lay open, pages filled with scribbles, arrows, and evidence, and beside it sat neat stacks of bank statements and printed transfers. He didn't flinch when he logged into his accounts, didn't hesitate as he began locking down access, freezing joint accounts one by one. The numbers blinked back at him, balances shifting into secured channels only he controlled. By the time Linda would wake and reach for her morning routine, the life of luxury she had carved out with his money would already be unraveling. He called his banker directly, a man he had known for 15 years, whose children he had once helped secure scholarships through his foundation. The banker's voice was brisk but respectful, and when David requested emergency freezes and audits, there were no questions, only action. Within an hour, the scaffolding of Linda's financial safety net buckled, the credit line she relied on severed like frayed wires. Next came the documentation. David organized every irregularity, every forged expense and hidden transfer, into folders labeled with brutal precision. Evidence for court, evidence for leverage, evidence for reputation. He scanned, saved, backed up, and locked copies away, ensuring that even if Linda or Greg tried to destroy the trail, the truth would outlive their schemes. By mid-morning, his allies began to answer his calls. Old friends from the construction industry, men who had swung hammers with him in his youth, and bankers who had trusted his handshake more than contracts. Each conversation was short, clipped, but decisive. They didn't need the full story. Just the tone of his voice told them enough. They promised support, promised to stand ready when the storm broke. David hung up each call with a satisfaction that spread through his chest like fire. He wasn't alone, and more importantly, Linda had no idea how quickly the ground beneath her was crumbling. That afternoon, he imagined the moment vividly, almost savoring it. The sound of Linda's sharp laugh dying in her throat when her platinum card was declined. He could see her standing at the country club, surrounded by her friends, smug with the arrogance of someone who believed herself untouchable. He could see the flicker of panic in her eyes as the waiter leaned in, apologizing quietly, offering to try again. And he could see her cheeks burn as the second attempt failed. The murmurs beginning, the whispers trailing after her like smoke. Humiliation. It was a small victory, but to David it was the first cut. The first time she would feel the sting of consequences she hadn't planned for. He didn't need to be there to know how she would react. The call would come, sharp and frantic, her voice climbing into panic as she demanded explanations. He could already picture her blaming the bank, then blaming the system, then finally realizing the truth. David had moved, and when she realized he wasn't blind, when she realized the man she thought she had buried was alive and fighting, it would terrify her more than any confrontation ever could. The phone rang just past 2, and David let it buzz 3 times before answering, his tone even, almost casual. "Something wrong, Linda?" Her voice was tight, brittle, the mask of control slipping. "My card," she snapped. It was declined. Twice. "Do you know anything about this?" David leaned back in his chair, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her panic to grow. "Strange," he said finally. "Maybe you should ask Greg." The line went quiet for a beat, her breath sharp on the other end, before she muttered something about calling the bank and hung up. David set the phone down, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was something colder, something sharper, satisfaction. Every move he made was deliberate, every step calculated to dismantle her carefully constructed illusion. For years she had manipulated him, twisted his trust, drained his accounts, all while laughing in his face. But now the laughter was gone. Now it was her turn to feel the floor drop out from under her. One humiliating decline at a time. The satisfaction didn't dull his resolve, it sharpened it. He picked up his pen again, crossing off the first steps in his plan. Accounts secured, evidence documented, allies contacted. The list ahead was longer, more dangerous, but he was ready. Linda and Greg believed they were still in control, still ahead of him in their little game. But David was no longer grieving, no longer blind. He was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. As the sun dipped low, spilling gold across the study, David sat surrounded by the tools of his counterattack. The room no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like command, like power. He closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence settle. The first strike had landed. Linda was already stumbling, and Greg, with his debts and his arrogance, would stumble soon after. This was only the beginning, and David knew it. The war had only just begun, and he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Because tomorrow, when Linda reached for her next card, when Greg checked his accounts, when the whispers around their friends grew louder, they would both learn the same chilling truth. The man they thought they had fooled was no longer their victim. He was their reckoning. And the next move would be even more dangerous. Ryan sat in his office long after the last patient had gone, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. He had been trained to read voices, to separate words from tone, to catch the hesitation that revealed what the mouth tried to hide. It was his work, his craft, the reason people came to him with secrets they wouldn't dare say aloud to anyone else. But nothing had prepared him for the voice now playing from his father's phone. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening intently as Linda's laughter floated out, cold and sharp, followed by Greg's confident drawl. The words slashed through him, plans for asset division, mocking David's trust, her casual dismissal of 25 years of marriage. He closed his eyes, pressing his thumb to his temple as if the gesture could stop the words from burrowing deeper. But they didn't stop. They only grew louder. His mother's voice, the one that had sung him lullabies, the one that had cheered at his graduation, was now filled with venom, dripping with greed. David sat across from him in silence, watching, waiting. He hadn't spoken since handing over the phone, hadn't pleaded or argued, hadn't tried to sway his son one way or another. He didn't need to. The recording spoke for itself. Ryan paused it, the room suddenly too quiet, the weight of betrayal settling like a stone in his chest. For months he had noticed small things, his mother's probing questions about his father's accounts, her subtle digs, her insistence that Greg was trustworthy, someone Ryan should listen to. He had ignored the unease, convinced himself she was only trying to protect the family. Now, every doubt he had buried erupted into painful clarity. She hadn't been protecting anyone. She had been grooming him, shaping his perception, preparing him to be the final pawn in her plan. He pressed play again, forcing himself to listen, forcing himself to face the truth without flinching. Greg's voice laid it out clearly, every word a map of manipulation. File in June, secure half, spousal support for life, and then Linda's laugh, bright and cruel. The man actually believes I love him. Ryan's stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He hit pause again, setting the phone down with shaking hands. He looked at his father, really looked at him, at the lines carved deeper in his face, at the exhaustion in his eyes, at the quiet dignity with which he sat. This wasn't the man his mother had painted as weak, as oblivious. This was a man who had carried their family on his back for decades, a man who had been betrayed by the very people he trusted most. For a long moment, Ryan couldn't speak. His training told him to analyze, to process. But this wasn't a patient story. This was his family. This was his life. Finally, he drew a shaky breath, his voice low but steady. She tried to use me. David didn't move, didn't even blink. But there was something in his stillness, a quiet acknowledgement. Ryan continued, the words heavy in his throat. All those questions, all those times she said Greg could help us. She was trying to turn me against you. She wanted me to believe you were careless, that you couldn't manage things on your own. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. I almost believed her. David's jaw tightened, his hands clasped together in front of him. But he didn't offer comfort, didn't rush to soothe. He let the truth hang in the air, raw and unvarnished. Ryan swallowed hard, his chest tightening with shame and anger. But beneath it all was something else, a growing clarity, a resolve he hadn't known he carried. He picked up the phone again, scrolling back, listening once more, this time as a professional, analyzing tone, cadence, choice of words. By the time the recording ended, he had no doubts left. He met his father's eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, there was no wall between them. I'm with you, Dad. The words came out firm, unwavering. I won't be part of her games. I won't be used. Greg thinks he can manipulate me because I'm her son, because I'd naturally take her side. But he doesn't understand. I see through him now. His arrogance is written in every word. He paused, leaning forward. They underestimated you, and they underestimated me. Relief flickered in David's eyes, subtle but undeniable. For all the steel he had shown, for all the strategy and resolve, he was still a father who had feared losing his son to the lies of a woman he once loved. Hearing Ryan's loyalty spoken aloud was more than reassurance. It was hope, fragile but real, threading through the darkness like light breaking through storm clouds. David nodded once, a small gesture, but his shoulders eased, the weight shifting ever so slightly. Ryan sat back, exhaling slowly, the tension bleeding from his frame. He thought of the years his father had worked to provide, the sacrifices made in silence, the long nights and early mornings. He thought of the stories Linda had told him, framing David as inattentive, careless, a man too blinded by work to see the family in front of him. And he realized how deeply he had almost fallen into that narrative. But no more. The truth was clear now, and it was unshakable. For the first time in weeks, David allowed himself a sip of whiskey, the glass catching the lamplight as he raised it to his lips. Ryan didn't miss the gesture. It wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement. A silent toast to the fact that the tide had shifted, that the isolation of betrayal had begun to crack under the strength of family restored. Ryan leaned forward again, his voice quieter, more certain. You're not alone in this. Whatever comes next, I'll stand with you. David held his gaze, and in that unspoken exchange, something long fractured began to mend. Father and son, bound not by blind loyalty, but by shared truth, by the clarity forged in betrayal's fire. The recording still sat on the desk between them, the damning evidence of Linda's deceit and Greg's manipulation. But now it wasn't just David's weapon. It was theirs. And as Ryan reached for the phone, replaying one last time the voices that had nearly torn his family apart, he felt no despair, only resolve. The night outside pressed against the windows, heavy and dark. But inside, the air shifted. Where grief had once suffocated, there was now a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. Ryan straightened in his chair, his training, his insight, his loyalty aligning with his father's cold determination. They were no longer two men isolated by lies. They were allies, prepared for what was coming. And what was coming, Ryan knew, would demand everything they had. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Because this time, the truth was on their side. The courtroom was colder than David expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, a sterile air heavy with judgment. He sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal suit, posture straight, hands folded with the calm of a man who had already fought his war in silence. Across the aisle, Linda and Greg whispered furiously, their polished confidence showing the first cracks. She wore a dress too bright for the setting, a desperate attempt at control through appearance. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and the room quieted to a tense hush. David's pulse stayed steady. He had waited for this moment, sharpened himself against grief, fortified himself with truth. And now the reckoning had come. Greg rose first, launching into the speech of a lawyer who had grown too accustomed to winning through charm and loopholes. He painted Linda as a devoted wife abandoned by a reckless husband, claimed financial instability, hinted at emotional neglect. His words filled the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her performance polished to the last tear. But David didn't flinch. He let them talk, let them weave their web of lies, knowing the blade he carried would cut through it all. When it was his turn, David stood, moving with the weight of decades that had built him into something unbreakable. His voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It carried steady and sharp, like steel against stone. He laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Bank statements, irregular transfers, fraudulent expenses masked as book club fees. Each document landed on the judge's bench like a hammer, building a rhythm of destruction. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder when Greg's name appeared tied to hidden accounts. His signature clear on transfers siphoned from David's fortune. Greg's face paled, his composure fracturing under the weight of exposure. And then David played the recording. Linda's laughter filled the room, cruel and unmistakable. The words cut through the silence, her voice mocking. "The man actually believes I love him." Gasps rippled through the spectators. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing as Greg's voice followed, spelling out the conspiracy in his own smug tone. No denial, no defense could erase what everyone had heard. Linda's tissue slipped from her fingers, landing soundlessly on the table. Greg's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the podium as if holding on to the last threads of a career unraveling in real time. The defense tried to object, to claim manipulation, but it was too late. The truth was carved into the room, undeniable and damning. The gavel struck again, calling for order, but the silence that followed was heavier than chaos. In that silence, David felt the years of betrayal, humiliation, and grief lift from his shoulders. Justice wasn't loud. It was sharp, clean, and final. The verdict came swiftly. Linda's claims were dismissed, her fabricated narrative collapsing under the weight of evidence. She would leave the courtroom with nothing. No share of his empire, no spousal support, no control over the life she had schemed to own. Greg faced more than defeat. The judge referred his conduct for investigation, his career hanging by a thread already frayed by arrogance. The man who had once leaned back with smug certainty now sat hunched, a ruin of his own making. David stood as the court adjourned, his hands steady, his head high. He didn't look at Linda as she crumbled into her chair, didn't offer her the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She had chosen her path, and it had ended here, stripped of everything but the hollow echoes of her schemes. He didn't spare Greg more than a passing glance either. The man who had thought himself clever, who had built his confidence on manipulation, was nothing more than a footnote in David's story now. Outside the air was crisp, the sky a clear blue that seemed almost symbolic. Ryan walked beside him, silent but resolute, their footsteps falling in rhythm. For the first time in months, David felt something he had thought lost forever: peace. It wasn't the fragile peace of ignorance, nor the hollow peace of compromise. It was the solid, unshakable peace of a man who had faced betrayal head-on and emerged whole. As they reached the steps, reporters called out, cameras flashing. But David didn't stop. He had no need for headlines. His victory wasn't for them. It was for himself. For the dignity Linda had tried to strip from him. For the independence he had rebuilt piece by piece. For the life he would live free of her shadows. He paused only once, looking up at the sky, letting the sun warm his face, a quiet acknowledgement that the storm had passed. Ryan broke the silence at last, his voice steady. "You did it, Dad." David glanced at his son, the corners of his mouth softening into the faintest hint of a smile. "No," he said quietly. "We did it." The weight between them, once filled with suspicion and manipulation, was gone. What remained was stronger than before, forged in truth and tempered by fire. They walked on, leaving the courthouse behind, each step carrying them further from betrayal and closer to renewal. David's empire remained intact, his dignity restored, his peace reclaimed. Linda had lost everything she had schemed for. Greg had destroyed the career he had built on arrogance, and David had reclaimed what mattered most. Not just wealth, but freedom, self-respect, and the quiet strength of knowing he had endured and prevailed. And as the city stretched before him, alive and waiting, David knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, one written not in deception or betrayal, but in truth. A life rebuilt, not on illusions, but on foundations that no one could ever steal again. Betrayal is one of life's most painful lessons, especially when it comes from the people we trust most. David's story shows us that no matter how deeply we are hurt, we still have the power to rise, rebuild, and reclaim our dignity. For older adults, the message is clear. Age does not mean weakness. Wisdom, experience, and resilience can be the strongest weapons when life tests us. Protecting what you have worked for is not selfish. It is an act of self-respect. And when others try to use manipulation or deceit, the truth, patience, and careful planning will always be stronger in the end. David also reminds us that relationships built on honesty are far more valuable than money or possessions. His son's decision to stand with him shows that real family is not about appearances, but about loyalty and truth. In your own life, never let betrayal define you. Let it sharpen you, let it guide you toward stronger boundaries, and let it remind you of your worth. Justice may take time, but it always comes when you stand firm in who you are. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too.